Good afternoon and welcome to our panel. As you can glean from the title, for the next 90 minutes, we're going to leave the confines of Argentina for a look at liberty, or the lack thereof, in the Spanish-speaking world. That would be Spain and Latin America. Joining us in this conversation, we have three highly qualified panelists. In fact, they're all so qualified that if I read their entire bios, I'd be up here all day. So I've abbreviated them, but you can find their full resumes online. To my immediate left is Lorenzo Bernaldo de Quirós. He's an adjunct scholar at the Cato Institute, executive chairman of Free Market Corporate Intelligence, based in Madrid. He's a member of the American Economic Association, vice president of Instituto von Mises Barcelona, a member of the Mont Pelerin Society, a member of the executive committee of the International Foundation for Liberty, chaired by Alvaro Vargas Llosa, a senior advisor at Citigroup Spain. Lorenzo is the author of Por una Derecha Liberal, which was published in 2015, a very interesting topic, I think, on the heels of the European Parliament vote. And he appears frequently on Spanish television and radio. He's a columnist in the Spanish media, and he's a member of the editorial board of El Economista. Alvaro Vargas Llosa is an award-winning writer and author focusing on developing countries and international affairs. His most recent book is Global Crossings, Immigration, Civilization, and America. Alvaro leads the Council of Business Advisors at the Foundation for International Freedom and is a senior fellow at the Independent Institute's Center on Global Prosperity. He has regular columns published in Spanish and English in the US, Spain, and Latin America, and he lectures widely also in the US, Latin America, and Europe. Daniel Raisbeck, on the far left, actually on your right, is a policy analyst at on Latin America at the Cato Institute Center for Global Liberty and Prosperity. Previously, he was a senior fellow at the Reason Foundation, the editor-in-chief of the Pan Am Post, and a lecturer at Universidad Francisco Marroquín in Guatemala. He writes frequently on Latin America. His op-eds have appeared in the Wall Street Journal and Foreign Policy, among other leading publications. He's a regular guest on Univision, NTN 24, and other Spanish-language news outlets. He holds a doctorate of philosophy in ancient history from the Free University in Berlin. Daniel's especially knowledgeable about Colombia, and in 2015, he was an independent libertarian candidate for mayor of Bogota. Was that for your sins or something like that? So please please join me in welcoming our panelists, and we're going to have a conversation about liberty in the region. When I joined the Wall Street Journal in the mid-1990s, optimism was breaking out all over Latin America. There was convertibility in Argentina. Chile was opening markets further. Peru was beginning to open markets. NAFTA was a year old. Fernando Henrique Cardoso, while not opening Brazil, was reforming the economy away from the rigidities of the military government. Colombia and Venezuela didn't look so good, but on balance, the region was liberalizing and backing away from the state. What was interesting about those reform governments is that none of them were liberal in the classical sense. They had simply run into reality. The 1980s had been a lost decade, and they were implicitly admitting that they had to change course by introducing practical solutions. I still recall a conversation I had with Ricardo Lagos, the former president of Chile, at the Waldorf in New York in the 1990s. And Chile had already opened a lot, but President Lagos made all the arguments to me about why unilateral trade liberalization was the best thing for Chile. So that was really an important moment in my mind, and I have to say that I thought we had won. I really thought we had won. Silly me. In politics, there are no permanent victories. And 30 years later, the region is once again stuck in the populist mud. The election of Javier Milei, I think, in this country is a real, gives a real boost to the spirits of liberals, not just in Argentina, but all around the region. And if you want to understand why, you just have to look at the countries in the rest of the region. I was going to list the countries that have really seemed to be losing their liberal way, but it's much easier to list the ones that are not, because the list is much shorter. That's Ecuador, Costa Rica, Uruguay, and Paraguay. But the rest of the region is in real trouble. And I just want to point out that my concerns about the region do not have to do with social democrats coming to power and raising taxes or raising tariffs or not privatizing or not opening markets. I think what scares me when I look at what's happening in politics in Latin America is that so many of the countries seem to have governments that have designed a strategy aimed at destroying democratic institutions, destroying the institutions that provide for checks on the executive, protection of minority ideas, free speech, political competition, pluralism, separation of powers. These things are really at risk in many countries in the region. And what history tells us is that if you lose those, you don't get them back. It takes generations to get them back. Now, I'm not saying that every country is equally at risk in this regard, but I've watched Venezuela and Nicaragua go. I have spent too many New Year's Eves toasting, next year in Havana. And you just don't reverse that kind of consolidation of power very easily. And I think this is the real risk that the region runs right now, and that we liberals have to fight against and try to ward off. The bad guys know the recipe. I mean, it's, for my friends, anything; for my enemies, the law. And if they get control of the judiciary, they put their enemies in jail, and the job is over. And we've seen that happening around the region too much. And I think there's some countries, big countries like Mexico and Brazil and Colombia, that are really at risk in this moment of losing their democratic roots. I'd like to start our conversation with Lorenzo, who can talk to us about what's going on in Spain, and I think it may be Exhibit A of what I'm talking about. Lorenzo?
Muchas gracias, Mary. Buenas tardes.
Thank you, Mary, so much. I'm delighted at being here with you in Buenos Aires, with so pleasant friends. Now, taking into account the relationship between Spain and Argentina, which are wonderful, just kidding, then I will have to ask Argentinian authorities for asylum, because this wonderful territory has recovered the flag of liberty. In Spain, we are losing our flag of freedom. What is happening in Spain is unheard of, unprecedented. it ever since the end of World War II. We are witnessing the assault and aggression against the plan of a government, a socialist communist government in Western Europe that is currently trying to destroy the two basic institutions of an open society, which is liberal democracy and market economy, classical liberal democracy. And this has to do with the fact that we have a social democrat government trying to manage the situation. No. This is an attack on the model that we Spaniards have built in 1977 after the death of General Franco, which has given us the wonderful opportunity during 40 years, a reasonable structure for defense, for liberty and prosperity and economic freedom. On the political front, on the institutional one, the Spanish government, which is a mixture of Peronism and Bolivarism, a bomb there, is making all institutional and constitutional instruments burst out, explode whenever they exercise power. They have taken office with a precarious minority under a mandate whereby the majority has a right to eliminate and wipe out all the institutions that control the government. So in Spain, we only have two mechanisms left for such purpose. One, judges within the state apparatus, and two, independent press, civil society. And the Spanish government has announced today that they are going to put in place a reform whereby judges who are, of course, advocating for equal opportunity before the law, including Spanish authorities and including also our president's wife, are the interest of imperialism, and they are advocating for evil interest. At the same time, the Spanish government has proposed that an act of Congress, Parliament in this case, be passed against the way in which free press is dealing with topics imposing censorship. It is very possible that we are going to have a positive attitude towards the government. So the government will eliminate the possibility for citizens, we Spaniards, to maintain these two basic pillars for a free society. At the same time as well, we are having a process whereby the economy is turning into a collective effort. We have taken all the contents out of the right to private property. We have a new law that has been passed to deal with private property, and the law provides that those that are occupying the property of an individual may be expelled from that property without any possibility of considering that he is a vulnerable person. Of course, they are wiping out this possibility, so anyone can really trespass your property and can take up your own property. And this is based on the fact that all this is paid by taxpayers. On the one hand, there's a mass intervention into financial markets, and of course, our continent, Europe, has already been prey in the hands of the states. So Spain is different. The old motto, Spanish, is different. Well, that motto, yes, it's true, because we are an Asterix-based village ruled by old-time people, where peaceful living has been eroded by means of a project which is changing the Spanish ideals, where basic liberties have been given to the hands of mass media, and where the possibility for a major radical change will be impossible in the future. or at least much more difficult. Well, we have been skipping from English into Spanish, depending on those who deal with this panel session. So we are always changing. First of all, thank you very much, Cato Institute, Libertad y Progreso as well. And last but not least, a special mention to the simultaneous translators, because they are, I am always highly sensitive and respectful for their job, and I will try to take this into consideration. They comply with major requisites for any get-together, be a successful event. And then I will try to take Lorenzo's experience and transpose it to Latin America. Well, in my opinion, in Europe, there are many problems, but there are two main problems, in my opinion. Number one, the beginning of the and end of the welfare state. It was an invention by Bismarck, right-wing parties, the 1900s. It was not an invention by the communists. Bismarck was a very intelligent person. Then Devon, mid-20th century, there was an explosion of ideas in Europe, and Latin America invented welfare state in the 1900s in Uruguay. Uruguayans invented the Latin American welfare state version. But that's another story. So I think that vis-a-vis center-right wing parties and ideas haven't been brave enough, or they have not have enough imagination to offer a project based on reforms. And the absence of an alternative project has given a great advantage to social democrats, and now to a more radicalized version of socialism, because you know that social democracy is falling in Europe, that has deprived the right-wing parties the possibility and ideas, of course, to prevail over in Europe. And now we are witnessing the most ultra-right-wing parties, and this is extreme. Center-right does not exist, and they have been subsumed by the managerial temptation. That is the temptation to be subsumed rather than to manage and operate a change. In our most governments in Europe have been very mediocre, tepid, warm, and they have lacked idealism. And I think that the center-right has been placed, as a result thereof, to a great disadvantage. And now we have radicalization, two extreme versions of the right-wing parties. Axel yesterday mentioned something which is very important, in my opinion, on the role of utopia in the speech and discourse of the left in Latin America. Many a time I tell the same thing to my audience, but I add something to utopia. I add the concept of myth. Utopia is the future, you know. It does not exist, but we tend to get to utopia. But myth is a lie. It has never existed. It is not existing now, and it will never exist. So the present is the result of the deprivation of many things that we have suffered before. So there's a collective imaginary that we are creating. So the left is telling you, you are poor because the right has stolen from you your own wealth. The Latin American right has been unable to give an answer to this. I don't want to make names, because I know that many of those names were presidents or authorities that had to govern the world in appalling situations. So I'm very respectful for such limitations. But the conclusion is always the same. The center-right governments in Latin America have generally lacked bravery, aggressiveness, and capacity to implement the reform. So the discourse, the words are very, very interesting, but of course there's a combination of what? Myth and utopia. So vis-a-vis such a discourse, they were unable to implement such reforms. So I think that Argentina is on the right track. Mr. Milei is trying to rob the left of myth and utopia, but then he's going to return to all that is placed to the right of the left, the capacity to attract them, to seduce them, and therefore invigorate the classical liberal discourse. And I'm closing right now by telling you the following. Here, what we have at stake is not the future of Argentina, but the future of all the Latin American region and the future of our classical liberal cause, those who advocate the ideas for freedom and liberty. If this move is successful, there will be a contagion effect, that will be a transforming effect for all the region. Thank you.
Can you hear me? Going back to what Alvaro was saying regarding the inability of the right when they govern to make decisions that will really foster countries in the region, I'd like to refer to the case of Colombia specifically. What's happening now is very serious. There is a crisis. I can tell you later, but the main point is that Gustavo Petro did not reach power in a vacuum. Gustavo Petro is the consequence of the past 30 years of the model of stagnation in Colombia for several governments of the center-right. So it is a stagnation because economic growth has been extremely low. It has grown, but not enough to take millions of people out of poverty. Taxes are extremely high. We exceed the OECD average. It is a completely over-regulated economy, and despite the idea that Colombia is a neoliberal country after a big opening in the 1990s, thanks to non-tariff barriers, there are studies that say it is less open today than it was in the 90s. We have a depreciated currency. In 1990, the US dollar was 600 pesos. Now it is 4,000 pesos per dollar, and last year it reached 5,000 pesos per dollar. It's something gradual. Perhaps it's not as serious as the case of the Argentine peso, but clearly population are losing their purchasing power every year, year after year. And that is leading to lack of satisfaction with the model, and somebody like Gustavo Petro is arising. So there are several signals of the danger. As you will remember, Petro started his career in L19. There were several acts that led to the killing of 111 people. There was an amnesty of M19. Petro arrived in Congress as a congressman in '94. He brought Hugo Chavez. He invited him to Colombia after, and they found ideological fine-tuning between the two of them. With Chavez, President Petro would say in Colombia, speaking in plural of what they were doing in Venezuela, we are changing the neoliberal model to neopopulism. We all know what happened with this model in the year 2010, when there was scarcity in Venezuela because of expropriations and price controls implemented by Chavez. Petro took a distance, but in 2013, when Chavez died, Petro went to the funeral, and he said that Chavez has been a great Latin American leader. in his presidential campaign, he drew apart from Chavez. Despite all of the other, Petro said that he was against the oil industry. So he started discussing climate change. He wanted to stop the oil industry in Colombia, and he said that those who wanted to continue with the oil enterprise, which is the main export from Colombia. It has been the main export for the past decades in Colombia. So no journalist has stopped him, and Petro completely changed the axis of the debate. There is one exception, Mexican Jorge Ramos, who said, "Do you think that Chavez is a dictator?" And Petro started talking about climate change, and he was re-asked whether he thought Chavez was a dictator, and Petro refused to answer. And that is how he won the elections in 2022 with this apocalyptic speech about climate change. But weeks before his election, Senator Iván Cepeda, in an interview with Financial Times, said that Petro has solid Marxist foundations combined with his reading of the French post-structuralism. The Marxist part is very clear. I have seen him defend the theory of the work, the labor value. When you choose a Marxist president, what you see is that the economy is completely paralyzed, because he paralyzed the oil industry as he promised. José Piñera was giving an example of an absurd scenario where what would happen if Saudi Arabia stopped exploring oil. That is exactly what Petro did in Colombia, and that is why the economy is not growing. There is an explicit crisis that is being caused to cause a collapse of the private-public health system, and they are taking measures to prevent employees from contributing to individual pension accounts, bringing everything to the pay-as-you-go system, which is a state system that is certain to collapse, and that will collapse as well. All of this affects the economy. I have mentioned the stagnation model. They haven't even allowed circulation of other coins. Despite the terrible devaluation of the peso, the only currency is peso. Now banks are saying maybe they should have opened, but it's now too late. And as regards the health system, when 50% of the population are in a subsidized regime, of course, this is a system that cannot be sustained in time. So it is relatively easy for Petro to stop wiring the money to them to make the system a state-run system. And then you have the agreement of Juan Manuel Santos with the FARC, negotiated in Havana, with FARC playing as locals. And the Colombian government, despite having weakened them militarily, they succumbed to the FARC. At this point, they are in Congress without having had enough votes. They have 10 seats in Congress, and they are allies to Petro. So everything I'm saying now is little, because, in fact, the true crisis comes now when Petro, having some problems in Congress, despite having formed a coalition that includes the Liberal and the Conservative parties, when he saw that his reforms were not being passed, he started talking about a reform of the Constitution, though he had promised that he would not change the Constitution. Our system in Colombia, there needs to be approval in Congress to change the Constitution. It has to be approved by one of the high courts. There has to be a plebiscite where the majority will approve this, but Petro, that would be a slow process, and he says he's not interested in the legal process, and he would like to have an extra, or an out-of-court, an extra legal change of the Constitution. What brings us to this problem is the rights state, but that is not enough for Petro. He's saying that the power is illegitimate and that it is the people that are the ones to decide on the Constitution. constitution. Of course, the people is the minority that supports him, not more than 30% of the population. As far as I understand, what he intends to do is have these open meetings where the constitution he wants will be approved. He has said that the fight against climate change and decarbonization of the economy are part of this constitutional reform. I see a lot of self-complacency in Colombia, people who say he is blowing balloons to the air, it is just threats. Some years ago, they used to say that Petro would never become the president, that he would never reach the second round. I believe he is a threat that has to be taken very seriously, and if he continues... Perdón.
Perdona, Lorenzo, muy rápido. Creo que lo que está diciendo...
What you are saying, I support, and we should be horrified. Colombia is a very important country, but there is a very important lesson here, which is that nothing is irreversible, not even success in politics. Colombia is a country that, when Latin America was full of dictatorships in the 70s, they avoided it except for the experience with Rojas Pinilla, which was a shorter, less traumatic experience that they overcame very rapidly. In general, Colombia was going against the trend in the region. In the 80s, the lost decade when Latin America did not grow, Colombia grew by 3%. When in Latin America, the respect for the law was not present, Colombia was a country that strengthens its trust on institutions and legal affairs. It's one of the countries where a taxi driver would tell me about their criminal code. Colombia was a country where important things were already given. However, it is a country that has leaped backwards, and now it is in danger of going to the current of Latin American dictatorships that are of a populist nature. And the same happened in Spain. Spain, for 40 years, boasted and exported to the world the idea of a successful political and economic transition, while now young generations are questioning the Spanish transition. And we know that populism, you know that bad ideas never die, and that's something we tend to forget. And very few prophecies have been so failed as the one of the end of history that Fukuyama launched 20 years ago. I believe that beyond what we are seeing in both continents, Europe and Latin America, there is a fundamental problem, and that is that we have to be aware that from the end of the Second World War, the liberal order classical liberal order has never been so much at risk in the world, both by external enemies and because of the internal elements that are eroding the foundations of liberal democracies. We have an attack, an international attack from autocratic powers that want to revise the international order and go back to a scheme from the past with a rebuilding of old empires. We can see that clearly in the Russia and the Ukraine war, which is a lot more important than this apparent fight that we see between neighbors. This is a revision of the international order, and in the democracies, we are seeing an inability of the center and right to articulate a discourse to respond to movements of another type, which are totally contrary to the foundations that have made prosperity and liberty possible in developed countries. And they feel proud, and they provide theories about of an illiberal democracy, as we see in Europe, in some Central Eastern country that is being quite successful. So we have a scenario that is quite similar to the period between the wars, during the 20s in the past year, where people would not wear their black or blue shirts. where the inability of developed democracies and center rights to raise the flag of freedom, having been contaminated and having accepted part of the woke message, and having turned or having become the managers of a model that is over, which is the social democrat model, not only because of efficiency and everything we say, but also because developed countries, it is democratically unviable. It's incredible that the old traditional right is the last representative of a failed model that has never been defended, and it becomes the repair workshop for a dead model. So if we don't respond from that point of view, and if we don't raise the flag of liberty, the horizon looks very different than we thought and dreamt 15 years ago, and as Alvaro said, we thought was irreversible, and we have seen nothing is irreversible. Who is leading the West? Biden? Does Biden lead the West?
Is Mr. Biden the leader of the Western world and Western civilization? Not really. El señor Scholz, el canciller alemán, es un hombre
Mr. Scholz, the German Chancellor, is he the leader, or has he lost his leadership? What about Macron? After the last elections, he is not in a position, because his country is not in a position to exercise moral leadership of the West. So we have a serious problem. Who is leading Latin America? Which is the Latin American paradigm to which we want to tend as Latin America? The natural role should be played by Brazil. Brazil is leading something. As Mary said, they have a serious problem in Brazil. They talk about juristocracy. There are a series of judges that have taken over the country and are exercising a sort of dangerous judicial dictatorship by affecting public liberties in an alarming way, and something similar is happening in Peru, not with judges, but with prosecutors. So Brazil is not in a position right now to lead Latin America. Mexico is in a position to lead Latin America. The hope we have is that the president-elect will be a traitor to her mentor. That's the hope we have. We cannot expect a leadership for the Western Hemisphere from Mexico. So basically, I agree with you. We have a serious problems of an absence or lack of leadership.
To just return to this question of the courts, the judiciary, because it seems so central to me to what happens when a country goes from being a competitive democracy where, you know, the pendulum swings back and forth, and okay, that happens, and maybe we don't like when it swings to the left, but it can come back. But in the cases of countries where that doesn't happen anymore because the institutions are collapsed, it was because the courts were no longer, there was no separation of powers. That ended. Ortega got all of the court in Nicaragua, and of course that happened in Venezuela also. How can a country, I mean, you have a case of Chile, right? In Chile, I think that, as Jose Pineda explained to us last night, there were so many gains among the population that they had something to lose, right? So they got in the fight to defend what was there. But in a lot of other countries in the region, it seems like a demagogue can easily come to power, get the power of the court, and destroy the so-called democracy. How are these countries supposed to protect against that, defend against that?
You want to go? No. Okay. That's a crucial question, but there's a distinction to be made between countries where those who hold political power dictate that the judiciary, who become their instruments, persecute their adversaries or establish certain rules whereby they get to benefit from the outcome, the general outcome of the judicial system and the overall procedure of the judiciary. But there's also what's happening in Brazil, which is a different case because you have the judiciary taking power. Nobody gave it that power. It took it. It's in the context of a colossal corruption scandal, of course, which debilitated, weakened the political institutions. I mean, obviously, you have to take into account the context. But essentially, they smelled a vacuum and they filled the vacuum. And now they have become so powerful that nobody can really set any limits. This guy, Alexandre de Moraes, who has become the dictator of Brazil, is a very dangerous figure. He has become not a protection against populism, which is what the judiciary should be in a region of the world where you have political populism. He has become part of populism, part of the populist ethos.
Rewind that tape. What could Brazil have done to avoid that
Well, the problem is it really came out of the Lava Jato scandal, the car wash scandal. That's if you have a colossal corruption scandal that delegitimizes everything, the president, his party, Congress, state-owned enterprises as big as Petrobras, and everything is delegitimized. And you begin, as a society, you begin to look to the courts as the saviors of the system. Inevitably, the courts are going to, I think, are going to act in a way that's disproportionately significant in that context. And then there's no going back, because now that that scandal is pretty much behind us, they continue to operate along those lines. So now who's going to set the limits? It's very difficult because, well, first of all, Lula has no interest in setting the limits because they work for him. They're working against the center-right and the right, so mostly he has no interest in setting the limits. But let's say somebody else gets elected tomorrow. Those courts are going to act against that president and against that government. And if he or she tries to set any limits on them, they're going to be accused of what? They're going to be accused of being undemocratic. So it's a very perverse kind of system that's emerged in Brazil, the leading country in Latin America.
Okay, let's switch over to Mexico, because I think that's a really hot topic right now. You have a new president who proposes to basically have Supreme Court judges elected directly, which will, along with dissolving the independent electoral body and a lot of the independent agencies, it looks like they're going back to the pre. Am I wrong? Daniel, do you have any thoughts about the?
I think that is a right appreciation of what they are trying to do. And for what I've seen in Brazil, there is a fundamental problem, which is the political involvement in the courts, having judges from a given political party that are providing their support. Well, in certain countries, when Alvaro was talking about institutionality or justice, in Colombia, justice used to be considered independent in the mid-20th century. So I think it is a very complicated institutional question. But in Mexico, what matters is to resist this attempt and fully politicize justice. If everything is up to elections and you have characters such as López Obrador, but that is, I agree, but that's inevitable in the power control strategy. This does not obey to a coincidence or an anecdote, as has been the case in other occasions where governments always want to get rid of institutional controls that are disturbing to them. This is not an occasional outcome, but rather a project and a model to dismantle the fundamentals of liberal democracies, resorting to the democratic principle. The democratic principle, which is the use of power with no restriction, as granted by the majority. And that phenomenon that we have seen in several countries in Latin America is a phenomenon that is taking place in Spain right now. We have to be aware that there is a real mechanism with the problem with the Soviet Empire to dismantle the basis of foundations for Western societies. If we are not aware of that challenge, we are going to have many problems because it is a permanent global attack that is very consistent. Let me add something else. As mentioned by Alvaro before, we've talked about lack of leadership in the region, but there is a clear leadership in Argentina with a style of government, and there is some hope not only in this country, we have noticed that yesterday and today, but also in the region. It is something exceptional because when Javier Milei won the elections, not only did he win over Peronism and Kirchnerism, as bad as they have been, but also he has defeated the center-right who were not up to making the reforms they had to. And that was similar to Guillermo Lasso in Ecuador and certainly Ivan Duque in Colombia. These were presidents who were elected with promises of freedom and liberating the market, but when they were in government, they ruled as if they were center-left, and they're always paying attention to the media. While in Argentina, I see exactly the opposite, where the government was elected, and beyond some technical differences that you may see, he is ruling along those lines, and that is a proof of leadership, and it's very hopeful for the region.
The case of Argentina is an epitome, and we hope that it will be successful. It is not a Latin American effect. It is a global phenomenon for those who advocate for liberty on a global basis, and this has been clearly demonstrated in the speech by President Milei at the sort of Vatican progressive meeting at Davos, where, in the middle of a capitalism contaminated, in the middle of a capitalism contaminated and polluted by businessmen smiling at ideas put forward by people they don't like, Milei gave us a lesson of coherence, consistency, and morality, appealing to the moral conscience of capitalism and the free society. And we have to thank President Milei for his attitude, and I said Vatican sort of attitude because it was absolutely contemptible.
The three sources of resistance against AMLO's megalomania these last 6 years: the courts, the electoral body, and the pink tide, which is civil society, right? So no wonder he wants to take control. On paper, having magistrates being elected is not a bad thing necessarily, per se. It's not a bad thing per se, except that in the context of Mexico and in the context of many other countries, evidently it all depends on who nominates them, what institution or what personality nominates them, and then once they have to campaign for that election, they become an instrument of whoever nominated them, and it's usually going to be the president or indirectly the president, and it's going to be part of the politicization of the court system. So what's happening in Mexico is extremely dangerous, and I'm very worried that the president-elect does not seem to be in a position right now to stop what is happening. And lo otro, let me switch to Spanish very quickly.
Okay.
Quiero añadir una cosa.
I want to add something to what you have both have said on Milei and Argentina. I would make an appeal from my respectful position vis-à-vis my Argentinian friends. Out of Argentina, we see that in Argentina there are classical liberals that are very respectful with a long track history of advocacy for liberty, who had been alone trying to spread the word, who should be helping and supporting the heroic effort of President Milei, but who, however, are trying to destroy this government as if those old-time classical liberals didn't want to. Sometimes I feel that they would be much more comfortable with the ominous return of Kirchnerite government than if President Milei were re-elected. Please understand that I have personal intellectual respect for my Argentinian friends, and if Milei is now the president of Argentina, this is the result of the hard work of spreading the word by classical liberals. But these classical liberals should be loyal to the cause of President Milei, the cause of liberty, vis-a-vis powerful foes and enemies that are trying to topple him, to overthrow him.
I want to add something to what you said about Mexico, because I think in addition to some of those things you named as impediments to AMLO turning into a dictator, the two I would add are the peso and USMCA. I mean, I think the openness of the economy, the openness of the capital market, you know, the fact that he really couldn't afford to have the peso go in the wrong direction affected a lot the way he behaved. And you see what happened the day after the election when the peso got slammed and the bolsa got slammed, and you know, the markets were basically sending a message to Sheinbaum that they were watching. So that raises a question for me about, and I guess the other thing which AMLO hasn't responded to, but I think he will have to, is if he wants to continue getting nearshoring investments for manufacturing in Mexico, I mean, they can't go on the same path with electricity and energy because the CFE is
Pemex owes $100 billion.
Yeah, and the CFE doesn't have the investment it needs to produce the electricity. So that raises a question to me about ways in which I was asking, you know, how does a country protect against a demagogue coming to power, consolidating power, taking over the courts? Just one man, one vote, one time, it's over. And I think that is a way of highlighting the importance of building institutions that can't necessarily be attacked. I mean, opening the economy is really, really important for solidifying defenses against that, because if the economy is open, they can't. A dictator can't do the same kinds of things, I think. And just want to add, and I think the dollar in Argentina would also be a good defense. As Gabriela Calderon talked about yesterday, you know, the dollar in Ecuador was very important to limiting the power of Correa, and eventually they got rid of them. I think that, you know, I'm sorry to say this to an Argentine audience, but I think you have to think when the Peronists come back, not if they come back, but when they come back, what kinds of tools will you have taken away from them? And that's why the dollar is very important.
Look at Chile, Mary. That's the answer. A bunch of demagogues tried to basically overturn the Chilean model, and they were not able to because enough Chileans had enough reasons to protect and defend the system which had benefited them to stop those demagogues from going that far, even though that same middle class had supported some of these demagogues in the streets against the status quo. But when it really came to, do I really want to change this model that's given me so much, or do I want to protect what I already have? They decided to protect what they already had. So the best, I guess, vaccine against demagogues is free market reform. The way Peronists, when they come back, and I agree with you, eventually they will, the way to prevent them from going back on what Milei is going to do is for Milei to be successful, because the middle class in Argentina will not allow them to go back on those reforms.
I agree with that, but I think you have to have some things that cannot be reversed. I think if you do dollarization, that is, you know, it's not convertibility, it's dollarization.
Yeah.
You can't reverse
I
it.
agree.
People
I
yeah.
agree. I'm with you on that.
Because some of the things that a free market government might do could be reversed, and you want to choose things, I think, that would really damage.
Yo creo que eso es un punto excelente que tú haces, Mary, y es algo que tal vez...
I think that, Mary, your point is okay. Technically speaking, about dollarization in Argentina, they have not taken into account that dollarization is a mechanism of defense, a monetary measure, which is irreversible. As Emilio Campo mentioned yesterday, in the case of Ecuador, people get used to being paid and save in a strong, stable currency, and people are going to reject currency that is being manipulated by the political caste. So the goal here, which is the end and the timing to achieve such a goal, such an end, is based on the fact that evidence shows us that a process of macroeconomic stabilization process should go hand in hand on a simultaneous basis with actions on the monetary side and on the fiscal and budgetary arena as well. So I think that it will be much more difficult to dollarize the economy later than what it has been up to now in other countries. And going back to what we said before, you have criticized, rightly indeed, to many classical liberals who live in the ivory tower and they give speeches when the Arabs are in Constantinople, sieging the city. Remember that the enemies of our enemies are not necessarily our friends, and that if politics have strange partners in bed, you run the risk of being suffocated with a pillow by that funny, strange partner. So it is absolutely incompatible when we see protectionism vis-à-vis free trade measures supported by President Milei, organic nationalism, liberal vis-à-vis an individualist conception of the state, classical liberalism, and those very strange allies, funny people, cause great damage to the cause for liberty in Europe. We have to take into account and never remember these ideas. And never forget, I'm sorry. I agree with you. The longer we keep these ideas, the more difficult the solution will be. If we can see some positive results, we can say, well, these ideas are no longer necessary, they lose energy and vigor. Next year, legislative elections will be crucial indeed, because we can see that the permanent is doing a sabotage again Milei's idea. So next year elections are placed under a very powerful light. It is very difficult that a reform of this sort will be made if we take into account that we're going, or Argentinians are going to have these next year elections. Why? Because everyone is afraid of a hike in the price of the US dollar. So if we do not engage in reforms right now, it will take a very long time to put them in place later on, and politically speaking, it will be much more difficult. I'm talking about dollarization, he says. So we have a political agenda and we have a political calendar, a time frame. I see two time frames. Number one, the results of reforms, and the other one is the impatience shown by people. It depends on the speed of evolution of popular impatience vis-à-vis deliverables. So if, of course, people see deliverables, they will not be so impatient. If people cannot see deliverables, patience will be eroded and the government would be weakened because he has a strong moral authority these days, President Milei, vis-à-vis the Argentine people. So, and the Argentine citizens, it is very important that classical liberals and non-classical liberals who do not wish to see the return of old-time ideas that have damaged the country stand up and make their voices be heard. Margaret Thatcher defined her economic policy as TINA. There is no alternative policy vis-à-vis her policy. Well, the same holds true for President Milei right now, and especially taking into account the disaster that Argentinians have witnessed over the last decades. We economists generally neglect the fact that the impact on expectations is the following. An economic stabilization program, which goes hand in hand with reforms that has a high cost, socially speaking, if it is credible and consistent, and it is stemming from a negative scenario, may have positive results much more quickly than if the scenario had been different. As Minister Caputo mentioned yesterday, it is highly probable that if expectations are not translated into positive facts, good deliverables from the reform, things will go worse.
But I think this one is for you, Lorenzo. ¿Cómo se posiciona?
How classical liberal position itself vis-à-vis Vox or similar parties in Spain? Well, we go back to the same scenario I mentioned before, the basic thesis saying that we must destroy socialism, we have to defeat socialism, and then we will discuss our model. No. The fundamental problem here is the fact that most of those parties have a lot to do with the social and economic model proposed by left-wing. They favor the state, protectionism, and intervention. Ideologically and politically, many of these parties are not feeling confidence in liberal democracies. In Europe, left-wing parties have been tied to two phenomena. Number one, most of the alternative right countries were founded by classical liberals and conservatives that were fed up with social democracy, gender-biased people, and a very small group made up of people that do not share the idea of free, open societies. Most of those political parties in Europe, liberal conservatives, have been eliminated. Only Meloni in Italy who was able to make that segment to persist in Germany, in Austria. They have disappeared. They are not our allies. Please bear in mind this. And as I told you before, those strange partners of us in bed will end up suffocating you with a pillow. Remember that. It is not only socialism, it is also statism in all its versions. And we advocate for liberty. Whether statism is left-wing or right-wing, we have to fight against it.
Question is for you, Alvaro. I'm going to translate. Why do you think that there's a scarcity of true leadership in the world compared to, what we had before, like Kennedy, Reagan, Adenauer, Schmidt, Kohl, and de Gaulle? Why they existed and we don't have anything like that now, or there's a shortage?
There's no single answer for that, Mary. I think it's very difficult to determine why that magical generation of the founding fathers, what made it possible for all of them to come together at exactly the same time and coincide at that particular moment in history. What made it possible for the leaders who fought the Second World War successfully to come together at the same time and in such a manner that made it possible for them to overcome the enemy. It's very difficult, I think, to determine what makes it possible. But I think you need to start somewhere, and you need to start by identifying and diagnosing the problem. And the problem is we have a total absence of leadership. I mean, compare what we have today with the folks that you mentioned, Reagan and Thatcher and John Paul and all these people. I mean, what a generation that was. Yeah. So perhaps what we need to do is we need to stop looking at a very small bunch of countries, and we need to look beyond those countries and seek leadership elsewhere. And you were mentioning Milei. If Milei is successful, obviously Argentina doesn't carry the weight that the United States does. It won't be the leader of the Western world. But if he's successful and he becomes a paradigm, there will be an effect in the United States. There will be an effect in some of the European countries. And I think that could generate a certain amount of leadership. But we do need to start somewhere, and we need to get rid of this complex that we have. We really have a complex when it comes to combating what's on the other side. Julien Benda, a very important French philosopher, described the 20th century as the organization, the intellectual organization of political hatred. And he was right about the whole thing, but he was particularly right about the intellectual part. I think we need to go back to the battle of ideas, because part of what makes for mediocre leadership is that leaders operate in a vacuum of ideas. Only when they operate in a system in which a particular set of ideas make it almost impossible for them to govern outside of the realm of those ideas, do you get strong leadership. When Reagan came to power, when Thatcher came to power, those ideas had been around for quite a while. They had matured. A lot of people, across civil society had made them their own. You had think tanks. Part of the media had bought into those ideas. So that leadership probably had something to do with the fact that those ideas were around.
Yeah, but do you think that some of what is happening now can be explained by the enormous affluence that we have? Because if you think about when Reagan came, that was the 70s, the end of the 70s. There were problems, You see Milei was elected as Argentina hits bottom. Mexico is not there. They re-elect AMLO. In an environment of affluence, you have the luxury of going more toward socialism, because you don't have to, you're not hit on the head by reality of what creates wealth. And I wonder if that has an effect.
I think you need to reach, I mean, this is depressing, but it's true, a crisis point, Mary. Great leadership usually comes out of great crises. You know, there are so many examples, and Argentina is a case in point. Milei could not have won 10 years earlier.
Yeah.
He could only have won in this kind of context. And again, Thatcher came to power because there was this sense that everybody else had failed. The Labour Party had failed, but also the Conservative Party had failed. And she came and said, we need a completely different Conservative Party.
Paradigm,
So you need people to have lost hope in the status quo big time.
I think so, yeah.
Un político español fallecido liberal que era
A Spanish politician that was very fun used to say that countries can only become liberal out of despair in present times. This in relation to what we said about crisis, the hypothesis that crisis opens up a window of opportunity to make transformations. Now, it opens up to both. We have seen very clearly how in certain situations of economic crisis in Europe, what has been open is the window to the bad guys, between quotes. So crises do not necessarily benefit us if you don't have the basic infrastructure of opinion, climate, and discourse to lead that moment. And that is one of the basic consequences of the success of President Milei in Argentina. However, that did not happen in other countries in the continent, where we saw that opportunities resulting from these crises were profited by the enemies of freedom to obtain power. Well, it depends. It's true, both sides can take advantage of it. But I'm thinking of the neoliberal reforms of the 1990s. Why was it possible to open up trade, privatize companies, deregulate some markets? Those reforms, I have a long book explaining this in detail. Those reforms were badly done. In some other cases, they were done and then abandoned. Some were done under dictatorship, others with high levels of corruption. But there were reforms. Why was that possible, that in a subcontinent where a few years before those ideas were hated by the majority, those ideas were the enemy? Why is it that in the 90s, a series of Latin American governments managed to put them in practice, even though they didn't do this properly? Well, because they had reached that state of despair. We were coming from several decades of failure, from a developmental movement to a failed movement. After the lost decade, the decade of zero growth, we had gone through significant monetary crisis that had an effect, and there has been the wear of a leading class that had been associated with those 3 decades of failures. So the opportunity opened up. In some countries, it opened more than in others, for instance, where the crisis was deeper. In Peru, for example, the monumental failure of the first government of Alan Garcia explains the possibility for some liberal reforms that were more traumatic than they were in other countries. Same thing with President Menem. He was able to make these reforms because he inherited hyperinflation, which is the most traumatic scenario a government can inherit. I fully agree, yes. If we put this in relation to what happened in developed countries, we had a time, a golden time, the golden years with the ideas of liberty, from the crisis of the Keynesian movement with stagflation in the 70s, But then, when the engine was put in movement again, the process was over. So people were tired with the reforms and the lack of thrust in many of the developed countries. We have to consider that because the terrible resistance of statu quo, once the agony has been overcome. And that is what happened after the first wave. That's actually Reagan-Thatcher. Once that stage was over, we started losing because of an excess trust, and you said that believing that it was irreversible, we started not making progress and not making progress is always a failure. The left think alike, and they say they never see a crisis that they will not take advantage of.
We have just a few minutes left. I think, Daniel, these questions are for you. You've written a lot on dollarization in Argentina. And there are two questions about dollarization. One is, ¿por qué creen que dolarizar más tarde con reservas acumuladas y acceso al crédito puede ser más difícil que dolarizar al inicio con reservas negativas? That's one. And the other one is, why do you think the Milei administration is seemingly reluctant to dollarize? Why are they dragging their feet? Could it be because the monetary aggregates show no meaningful signs of decelerating growth?
Bueno, en cuanto a la primera pregunta, yo siempre he estado convencido que se podía dolarizar.
I have always been convinced that they could dollarize on day one. We saw that Ecuador dollarized with negative reserves, but as Alvaro was saying, it's very easy to come here and sit and say what you have to do, and something different is to be there ruling a country. So that's my first answer. And to the second question, I do not know. In my opinion, seeing it from the outside, that was the strongest proposal in the campaign, dollarizing and closing the central bank. Con Gabriela, we wrote the policy brief in June or July last year, supporting the idea when nobody in Washington was paying attention to this. And then Milei won the PASO and the primaries, and they started discussing dollarization all over. And as I was saying yesterday, in Cato we have the advantage that we are the only institute that has studied in detail the issue of dollarization. And since this had only been done in 3 relatively small countries, it's a niche subject, so not many people have looked into the details of Panama, Ecuador, and El Salvador. And that is why it may seem difficult for a large country like Argentina to dollarize. I think all of the conditions, if you see how this was done in other countries, and it's been successful in all 3 countries for different reasons. In the case of El Salvador, it hasn't had the growth they have had in Panama due to the banking opening, but as you mentioned, I am convinced that dollarization saved Ecuador from the worst effects of Correa that could have been another Venezuela if it hadn't dollarized.
I think it's a little bit of a misnomer or misunderstanding to think that reserves are going up because capital is coming into the country. Actually, capital is not going to come into the country as long as you have the cepo, and there's a lot of uncertainty. So they're printing pesos, using the pesos to buy dollars, which is what they're adding to the liabilities. So the idea that under the current circumstances you're building up reserves, I think is a little bit misleading. Sorry, go ahead.
Sí, yo simplemente añadiría que estoy de acuerdo.
I agree. There was a lack of confidence in themselves. If you decide to lift the cepo, the exchange restrictions, there may be volatility at the beginning. You may have a rise in the price that you want to maintain relatively stable. But if you have a credible program that generates trust and is coherent and attacks various fronts simultaneously, it will stabilize. The market will stabilize it. There was a lack of confidence, I believe. But anyway, now it's useless to cry over spilled milk. What we have to think is what we should do in this scenario. I think they shouldn't resign to this idea. Opinion leaders say that the government has put off this idea, but this is going to cross with the elections next year, and that's going to be a disrupting political element. In the midterm, you have an important factor in favor of the thesis that we have discussed so much of dollarization. In dollarization, you will be more stably anchored. You have a more stable macro stability, more than with fiscal policy only. With dollarization, the government loses control of monetary policy. You have the fiscal policy, so the dollarization support will help you discipline the fiscal policy even more and have some more sound macroeconomic framework.
I have a question here that could have a very long answer, but someone in the audience wants to know what you think about Islam expansionism in España and Europe.
El Islam. Vamos a ver, uno de los elementos que ha determinado los
One of the elements that have determined the results in European elections is no doubt the panic there is in Europe with Islamic immigration. That hostility is extending to many other phenomena broader than just Islamic immigration. You have a problem without solution. We have a river, the Mediterranean, that separates two physical spaces with a disparity of income that is the largest in the world. The problem with Islam or with Islamic immigration has deepened so much in Europe, not only because they are bad and fundamentalists, but because of a fundamental issue, the culture of the principle of equality before the law. In almost all countries, there have been positive discrimination programs by virtue of which privileges have been granted to integrated Islamic communities for them to maintain their identity and their privileges from the legal point of view, and that has made their integration in European societies very difficult, and it has generated large ghettos. In addition to that, in almost all European societies, especially in the north and center of Europe, not only have they been given a privileged status where they do not look at the individual but at the rights of the collective they are part of. And that has been accompanied by significant budgetary allocations, generous budgetary allocations. So you have increasing opposition to Islamic immigration. Then you have the feeling that they cannot be integrated and jeopardize social and political stability of receiving or host countries, and in many cases, this is generating a social fracture that is very significant. And one of the first examples you are very familiar with, and is emblematic in Europe, is the case of France.
Let me add something quickly, Mary. Why is the Muslim population so much more integrated into American society than it is into European society? Because the American system is an infinitely more flexible, open, and therefore integration-prone, if I may use that term, society and socioeconomic model than Europe. The welfare state in Europe has created a very rigid type of society in which an influx of a significant number of people can create those kinds of impasses that you don't see in American society, where you see other problems, but not that problem. So I think the much more open and flexible system that you have in the US is in large part explains why people have been integrated into that society, even though they came from religious backgrounds that were very different from the American.
Y luego hay cosas que resultan irónicas.
And there is something ironic in the exercise of the use of immigration from the political point of view by populism. If you allow me, the comment, it is between comic and ironic. That one of the big European champions against immigration, including Islamic immigration and whatever, is the president of Hungary. Nobody migrates to Hungary. Hungary is one of the European countries that exports immigrants. They do not have a problem with immigration. They have a problem of people migrating out of Hungary. So the political use of immigration in a society that is old, rich, fearful, and with some uncertainty, that is terribly attractive to be exploited. And of course, as we can see, results are quite evident. This is a topic that allows me to come back to Latin America. The xenophobic reaction that you start seeing in many Latin American countries against Venezuelan migration. 8 million Venezuelans have already migrated. Many have gone to Spain, the United States, but also to Latin America. There are several countries that have 1 to 2 million Venezuelans. In Brazil, there are almost 2 million Venezuelans. And we begin to see a reaction at the basis of the pyramid and the political elite and leading class candidates to municipalities or presidency who are going to use this as a flag. And as Maria Corina Machado said this morning in her video, one of the consequences that would be if Maduro won the elections on July 28 would be a new wave of Venezuelan migrants. If there are 8 million who have left the country and you add up another 8 million, imagine what that means to Latin American societies and to Spain as well. It's going to mean that countries that have 1 to 2 million migrants may have 2 to 4 million. And that is going to create a xenophobic, nationalistic reaction that is unprecedented in our Republican history. Spain is one of the European countries with least generalized rejection to Latin American and European migration. And in the case of the Moors, the Muslims, there is an old tradition of hostility that we inherited by tradition, and it's most of Spanish immigrants are from Latin America and Central Eastern Europe. The Moroccans are just a small number, not even 4% of total immigrants in Spain. But when Pedro Castillo won, didn't he promise that he was going to expel Venezuelans? He said the bad Venezuelans, the criminals. But before that, there was a candidate who said that Venezuelan women looked very beautiful and very well fed, and that it was not true that there was poverty in Venezuela and why they had migrated. And I fear this is going to grow. We just have 1 minute.
In all of the region, and my country as well. There has been a kind of totalitarian, I would say, effort to silence people who you don't agree with. In some countries, it's been worse than others. Can each of you, with the few minutes we have remaining, which is about 3. Comment a little bit on where you see the free speech issue going in countries like Spain, Brazil, Mexico, Colombia, Chile. I mean, will it be defended, or will there be a kind of a self-censorship that sets in? Where are we going?
Pues, a ver, lo que yo veo en mi país, en Colombia, es
What I see in my country, Colombia,
sí ha habido un
is that
intento de
there has been
censura,
an
de
attempt to
imponer,
censor,
el discurso,
to impose
nosotros decimos progre,
the
políticamente
progressive
correcto,
or
pero
politically
creo que eso
correct
siempre genera una
discourse.
reacción,
That
porque
generates a
el lenguaje
reaction
es algo
because
tan natural,
language is
tan
something so
espontáneo,
natural
que
and
es prácticamente
spontaneous
imposible
that it is
imponerle a toda una
almost
población
impossible to
un tipo
impose
de lenguaje,
upon
ciertas cosas que no
population
se
one
pueden
type
decir.
of language. There are things that cannot be said.
Realmente creo que comparado a Estados
And
Unidos,
compared
sobre
to the
todo,
United
este
States,
tema en
this
América
topic
Latina,
in Latin
pienso,
America,
no es
what
tan
I have
grave
seen
en
is
este
not so
momento,
serious
pero
right
claro, sobre
now,
todo al nivel
but
de
especially
élites y sobre
at the level
gente
of
que
the
va a hacer sus
elites.
estudios, sobre todo de
There are
posgrado en
people
Estados
who
Unidos o tal vez
take
en
their
Europa, y
postgraduate studies in the US or
regresan,
Europe
y
and
entonces
go back,
regresan con
and when they go back,
esa ideología y
they
la
have this
intentan imponer,
ideology and they
pero
try
no
to
creo
impose
que
it,
estén
but I
teniendo
do not
tanto éxito
think
como
that
sí,
they
como
will
se
be
espera.
as successful as they are in the US. Un minuto.
En España, en concreto, la dictadura de la
In
corrección
Spain,
política
the
y la
dictatorship
imposición
of
de las
politically
religiones
correctness
postmodernas
and
es
the imposing
brutal,
of postmodernism,
impulsada por el
this is
gobierno
brutal,
e
it is
impuesta por la ley.
imposed by law and supported by the
Indiscutiblemente.
government.
Y el resto de Europa,
And the rest
es
of
decir,
Europe,
Europa
that is
dominante hasta ahora, la
the
que,
dominant
entre comillas,
Europe,
si ponemos emblemáticamente
if
el
we
ejemplo de la
say,
Comisión
if we
Europea,
give the example of
ha
the
abrazado
European
con
Commission,
entusiasmo
they
las
have
religiones
embraced
postmodernas.
postmodern religions. This is one of the phenomena that we have seen, and that is why we have seen the reaction in these elections. The European center-right has bought these postmodern religions. I would say that in the United States, this was born in the academia. I quoted a wonderful book yesterday, The Closing of the American Mind. This is a book alerting against this problem. This was born in the academia, then it went to Hollywood and popular culture, and then to the rest of society. And the courts and the political class have taken it. In Brazil, the responsibility is absolutely of the courts of justice. Look at, it is the courts of justice that are the place where a dynamic against freedom of expression is born. I am for counteracting all this with the popular liberal culture. I always dream of a liberal soap opera where instead of having two people fighting to inherit as if wealth was a zero sum and that heritage is for you or me, rather one soap opera where you can only have social mobility by the girl working as a housekeeper should marry the son of the owner of the house. Why don't we have a soap opera that will distribute the values of freedom in a more effective manner?
Right on time. I want to thank the Cato Institute and Libertad y Progreso, and thank you, all of you for joining us. Please give a hand to our panelists. Thank you.
Gracias.